Before we enter the realm where time has stood still, take a quick second to like and subscribe, only for those who enjoy this kind of immersion, of course. And if you don't mind, leave a comment below telling me where you're following us from. And your thoughts. It makes us happy. There's something wonderful about seeing how far apart and connected we all are. Now, dim the lights, maybe get your place ready for travel, and let's relax as we dive into tonight's adventure together. We'll take a quick glimpse of our story. Imagine the air. It hangs thick and heavy, almost viscous, clinging to your skin with a damp chill. It carries the smell of the earth itself, a potent aroma of wet soil, of countless seasons of decaying, leaves of moss and fungus, and the subtle, wild scent of unseen animals. Every shadow, thrown by the colossal trunks of ancient trees, seems to writhe and twist, appearing to hold a pair of watching, waiting eyes. For a peasant to be here, to stand in the heart of this forbidden place, utterly alone, is to feel like a ghost in his own land, an intruder in a world that should have been his birthright. The felling axe in his hand feels deceptively light, a familiar extension of his arm, but the weight of his crime, the sheer gravity of his trespass, is an immense, crushing burden in his mind. He's not here for the ultimate prize, not for the king's deer. To even contemplate such an act would be to accept a death sentence. No, his goal is far more modest, his crime one of simple survival. He's here for a single fallen tree, a precious, desperately needed source of firewood to keep the biting cold from the bones of his family. He works in a frantic silence, his ears straining, every nerve ending alive with fear. But then he hears it. A rustle of leaves behind him. It's not the sound of a foraging squirrel or a startled bird. It's a heavier sound, a deliberate sound, the sound of a man. His blood runs cold. It's the king's forester. In this single, heart-stopping moment, beneath the vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent canopy of the royal woods, this peasant's life, his future, and the fate of his family is about to change forever. Forget the romanticized images of stone castles and the glint of shining armor for just a moment. Erase the fairy tales of gallant knights and damsels in distress. Instead, I want you to imagine a world far more primal, a world steeped in deep, pervasive silence, a world of deep woods that feel both infinite and claustrophobic. Picture a realm where the sudden, sharp snap of a twig underfoot could represent the stark, brutal difference between securing a hot meal for your hungry family and being condemned to the living death of a cold, lightless prison cell. This wasn't some fanciful story told by a roaring fire. For the ordinary men, the hard-working women, and the often forgotten children of medieval France, this was the harsh, unyielding reality of their existence, of a place they could see every day, but could never truly enter. The king's forbidden forest. This is not a story you've likely heard before. It's not a grand chronicle of kings and queens holding court in their opulent palaces, nor is it a saga of epic battles and political intrigue. This is a story written in common blood and quiet sweat, a history that soaked unseen into the rich, dark soil beneath those ancient, towering trees. We are about to embark on a journey back in time, to an era when these vast, untamed forests were the very heart of a kingdom, the pulsing green center of a nation's life. They were, all at once, a source of life-giving sustenance for the desperate peasant, a sprawling, dangerous workplace for the tireless woodcutter, and an exclusive private playground for the king and his chosen few. It was a place defined by its shocking contrasts, a world of vibrant life and sudden, violent death, a place of whispered, terrifying folklore, and the cold, hard steel of brutal law. So I invite you to set aside the comfortable, romantic image of merry men in green tights, redistributing wealth with a smile, The truth of the king's forest is a tapestry woven with threads far more complicated, far more challenging, and infinitely more compelling. Before we can possibly comprehend the lives of the people who existed on the fringes of these great woods, you have to first understand the forest itself. This was never just a collection of trees, a simple geographical feature on a map. In the deeply symbolic and spiritual landscape of the medieval mind, the forest was a totally separate realm. It was perceived as a world existing outside the established laws of men, a wild kingdom governed by its own ancient, unwritten rules and inhabited by its own populace, both natural and profoundly supernatural. Let's try to conjure an image of a specific place, the ancient Forat de Beer, a sprawling wilderness that we now know by the more elegant name of Fontainebleau. For millennia, before any king would lay claim to its vastness, this was a wild, untamed domain, a force of nature in its own right. You must try to picture a landscape stretching over 22,000 hectares. That's more than 54,000 acres. It was a dense, intricate tapestry of towering oak, majestic beech, and resilient pine, all interwoven with a treacherous and dramatic topography of stark sandstone gorges, deep and hidden caves, and vast, misty marshlands that seemed to swallow the light. This was a truly primeval world. The trees were not merely trees. They were titans, their gnarled, moss-covered branches reaching desperately for a sky they almost completely blocked out. This created a canopy so thick, so all-encompassing, that the forest floor often lived in a state of perpetual twilight, a gloomy, mysterious world even at high noon dot in this world. The silence was not an absence of sound, but a living, breathing thing. It had a presence, a weight. It was a silence broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind moving through the high branches, the distant, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a woodpecker excavating its home, or the sudden, piercing cry of a hawk, circling in the small patches of visible sky. The air itself was different here, always cool, crisp, and filled with the rich, earthy scent of damp moss, decaying wood, and the promise of wild mushrooms after a rain. But this was no peaceful park, no tranquil nature reserve. The medieval forest was a place of constant, dangerous activity, teeming with life that could be both a life-saving blessing and a deadly curse. Great herds of red and roe deer, the king's prized possessions, moved like phantoms through the dense undergrowth, their fleeting forms a constant, painful temptation. Wild boar, hulking beasts of muscle and fury, with their terrifyingly sharp tusks and notoriously mean tempers, roamed the deep woods, a creature so formidable and so dangerous that hunting it was considered a true test of a nobleman's courage and martial prowess. And then there were the wolves. Their packs were a constant, lurking threat to any livestock that strayed too far from the relative safety of the village, their haunting, chilling howls echoing through the long, dark winter nights, a terrifying reminder of the wilderness that pressed in on all sides. But the dangers that lurked within the forest were not just physical, not just a matter of tooth and claw. To the medieval peasant, a person whose life was governed by faith, superstition, and tradition, the forest was an enchanted and often profoundly evil place. It was the wild, liminal boundary, the space that existed beyond the reassuring peal of the church bell, beyond the comforting order of the village. It was a place where the veil between the world of the living and the world of spirits felt terrifyingly thin. Folklore, passed down through generations, spoke of a host of spirits and creatures who considered the forest their exclusive home, and they were not known for being friendly to human trespassers. There were whispered tales of the Dames Verts, the green ladies, ethereally beautiful nature spirits who could appear to a lone traveler, luring him with promises of love or treasure deep into the woods, only to lead him to his doom or drive him mad. While devout hermits might seek the solitude of the woods to find God, It was more commonly believed to be the haunt of witches who drew power from its ancient darkness, of demons, and most terrifyingly, of the Helican's hunt, a ghastly, spectral procession of the damned, led by a demonic huntsman, doomed to ride through the woods for all eternity, their horns sounding on the stormiest nights. To hear their coming was an omen of war, plague, or your own imminent death. People genuinely believed that certain ancient trees, particularly oaks, were sacred or conversely, deeply cursed. To chop one down without the proper rites or permissions wasn't just a crime against the king. It was an invitation for supernatural ruin to befall your entire family. These were not just fanciful bedtime stories told to frighten children. They were deeply held, unshakable beliefs that shaped and informed every single interaction with the woods. To consciously step into the forest was to step into a place of profound and multi-layered danger, a place where you could lose not just your life to a boar's tusk or a forester's arrow, but your very soul to the dark and ancient powers that dwelled within. So this brings us to the central question. Why was it forbidden? Why would a king go to such lengths to claim such a vast, wild, and frankly terrifying place entirely for himself? The answer, when stripped of all its medieval pageantry and legal complexity, really comes down to two things, two obsessions that defined the aristocracy: the animals that lived in the forest and the greenery that sustained those animals. You see, the word forest in medieval France, and indeed across much of Europe, did not originally mean a place covered in trees. That is a modern interpretation. It was first and foremost a legal term, a designation of status. A foret, derived from the medieval Latin phrase forestis silva, which in turn came from the classical Latin word foris, meant a place outside. It designated a territory that was outside the bounds of the common law, fenced off not necessarily by a physical barrier, but by a royal decree. It was an area of land set aside by the king for the exclusive use of the king, primarily as a personal hunting reserve for him and the high-ranking nobles he chose to favor. French kings from the early Carolingian dynasty onward saw these immense tracts of land as potent and visible symbols of their power and sovereignty. The great unifier of Europe, Charlemagne, was a hunting fanatic who established and protected royal forests across his vast empire, using them not just for sport, but as a way to demonstrate his absolute control over his territories, asserting his authority over the wildest, most untamed corners of his realm. For the Capetian kings who followed and truly forged the nation of France, the forest was prized above all for its endless, self-renewing supply of game, the lifeblood of the aristocratic hunt dot to protect this royal playground. A complex, pervasive, and uniquely brutal legal system was conceived and ruthlessly enforced, the forest law. It is crucial to understand that this was not the same law that governed the lives of everyone else. It was a separate, harsher, and far more arbitrary legal code with one primary, overarching goal: to protect the venison and the vert. This simple, alliterative phrase encompassed everything the king valued. Venison referred to the game animals themselves, principally the noble red deer, the roe deer, and the fearsome wild boar. Vert, which literally means green, referred to everything else: the trees that provided cover, the undergrowth where animals hid, the very greenery that sheltered, and most importantly, fed the game. And under forest law, damaging the vert was considered just as serious an offense as killing the venison. Felling a young sapling that might one day provide food for a stag was legally equivalent to slaying the stag itself. Enforcing this draconian law required a whole hierarchy of officials, and these men were among the most feared and hated figures in the entire kingdom. As the system became more formalized, a central office for the Masters of Waters and Forests was created in 1291 to oversee the entire vast and profitable enterprise. Below these powerful administrators were various wardens and masters. But the men a common peasant would actually encounter, the men who haunted their waking nightmares, were the foresters or foresters. They were the gamekeepers, the beat, cops of the woods. They patrolled the forest boundaries, investigated suspected crimes, collected fines, and arrested suspects. They were often recruited from the lower rungs of society themselves and were notorious for their corruption, their petty cruelties, and for making a tidy profit from fines and confiscated goods from the very lands they were supposed to be protecting. If a peasant was unfortunate enough to be caught red-handed poaching the king's deer, the penalty could be horrific, designed to be a terrifying public spectacle. The most extreme punishments, such as summary execution by hanging from the nearest tree, were typically reserved for repeat offenders or those who resisted arrest. But the law was still a symphony of terror. Tailies, official complaints, and court records from the era are filled with grim stories of poachers being blinded, usually with a hot poker, so they could never again aim a bow. Others were castrated, a punishment seen as fitting for an offense that stole the king's virile property. In one particularly gruesome and symbolic form of justice, a poacher might be sewn into the hide of a freshly killed deer and then hunted down, torn apart by the Lord's own hounds as a form of sport. Just imagine the terror of being accused. A forester could, on nothing more than a flimsy suspicion or a personal grudge, demand to search your home. If he found so much as a snare, an unauthorized bow, or a single deer bone you might have found brought home for your dog, you could be dragged from your family and thrown into prison. And a medieval prison was not a place of rehabilitation. It was often a lightless, subterranean pit, overflowing with filth, disease, and despair. It was a place of institutionalized starvation, where you might languish for the legally prescribed, year and a day, just to have your case heard by a special traveling court, the heir that only visited the region periodically. For many, the only way out was to have their family pay a ruinous, crippling fine, a ransom they could leave. Family utterly destitute, forced to sell their land, their tools, their future for generations. This was the cold, hard, iron fist of the forest law. It was a system designed to make one thing crystal clear to every man, woman, and child. The forest belonged to the king, and everyone else entered on his terms, or not at all. For the vast majority of the population, the 90% of people who were rural peasants, life was a relentless, back-breaking grind, a cyclical struggle for mere existence, dictated by the seasons and the harvest. Most lived in small, tightly knit villages, often huddled in the shadow of a lord's castle or a monastery. Their homes were simple, dark, one-room hovels, constructed from a crude timber frame, with walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of woven twigs, mud, and animal dung. Their diet, in a good year, was meager and monotonous. Heavy, coarse bread made from rye or barley, thin soups or pottages made from whatever vegetables could be grown in a small garden plot, and porridge. Meat was an almost unimaginable luxury, a rare treat reserved for feast days or the end-of-year slaughter of a precious pig dot in this world of constantly just barely getting by. The great forest on their doorstep was a source of constant agonizing conflict. It was both an overwhelming temptation and an ever-present terror. It was, in essence, a giant locked pantry, its shelves overflowing with everything they needed, its doors guarded by the threat of mutilation and death, while they were absolutely forbidden from touching the grand prize, the deer, the boar. The noble game, the king's law, in its complex web of regulations, did grant them a few precious and always strictly controlled rights. The most critical of these was the right to gather firewood, a privilege known as a stover's. This sounds simple enough, but it was hopelessly tangled in a thicket of rules and regulations. A peasant couldn't simply walk into the woods and chop down a tree for his hearth. That was a serious crime. They were usually only permitted to take deadwood that had already fallen on its own. In some areas, they were allowed what they could gather by hook or by crook, a phrase that has survived into our modern language but originated here. It meant they could literally use a simple reaping hook or a shepherd's crook to pull down dead or dying branches from standing trees. Anything that required a proper axe was usually forbidden. Even this limited right often required the payment of a small fee to the local lord or forester. To be caught taking a healthy green branch in act, known as vert damage, was a serious offense that could result in a heavy fine. Another vital, life-sustaining right was that of pannage, which was the right to graze pigs in the forest during the autumn months. For a few crucial weeks, entire village herds of swine would be driven deep into the oak and beech woods to fatten up on the seasonal bounty of acorns and beechnuts. This was a crucial part of the peasant economy, as these pigs, fattened for free on the forest's riches, represented the primary source of preserved meat, bacon, ham, and sausage that would see a family through the lean, hard winter. But again, this was not a free-for-all. It was a controlled privilege that came with a fee, usually charged per pig, and was restricted to a specific time of year. The forest also offered a host of other small, but significant, bounties that a peasant family could forage for, assuming they weren't caught. Wild nuts like hazelnuts and chestnuts, tart wild berries in the summer, a vast array of herbs and plants for use in folk medicine, and of course, wild mushrooms. But every single trip into the woods, even for the most innocent purpose, was fraught with risk. Who was to say that the branch you picked up had fallen on its own, and that you hadn't broken it off? Who could prove you were digging for medicinal roots and not setting a snare for a rabbit? In the eyes of a suspicious and often corrupt forester, a peasant's presence in the woods was justification enough for an accusation, and an accusation was often as good as a conviction. But perhaps the biggest and most audacious crime a peasant could commit, short of killing a deer with his own hands, was the act of assarding. This was the medieval term for the clandestine act of clearing forest land to create new, arable fields for farming. With the population of Europe steadily growing throughout the High Middle Ages, the pressure for more farmland was immense. To a peasant with a growing family and a tiny plot of land, a small, secluded patch of woods could look like the key to survival, the difference between sufficiency and starvation. But to the king and his forest administration, assarding was a multi-layered crime. It was the willful destruction of the deer's habitat, a direct attack on the vert, and it was, quite simply, the theft of royal land. So the peasant lived out his days in a state of constant, simmering tension. The forest held everything he and his family so desperately needed: more wood for warmth and cooking, more food to fill their bellies, more land to secure their future. But taking any of it meant risking ruinous fines, horrific physical mutilation, or the living death of the prison pit. Every single day was a quiet, desperate calculation of risk versus reward. And for a man whose children were shivering with cold, or whose family faced the gaunt prospect of a winter of relentless hunger, the thought of one extra log, one secretly snared rabbit, was a powerful, and all too often fatal, temptation. Of course, not every single person who entered the forest was there illegally. For a select, skilled few, the deep woods were not a place of temptation or terror, but their workshop. Their entire lives revolved around legally harvesting the very resources that others were forbidden to touch on pain of death. These were the sanctioned forest workers, men whose trades were difficult, dangerous, and absolutely essential to the functioning of medieval society. First and foremost among them were the buckarans, the woodcutters. These were not peasants sneaking a few sticks of firewood. They were highly skilled professionals, the lumberjacks of their day. Wood was the fundamental building block of medieval life, the universal raw material needed for practically everything. It formed the massive, complex timber frames of soaring cathedrals and humble parish churches, the sturdy beams of houses, the hulls of ships, the handles of tools, and the barrels or tonneaux, essential for storing and transporting wine, ale, and water. The sheer scale of their work is difficult to comprehend. The timber framework for a single large cathedral, like the one in Rouen, could require the felling of over 1,200 mature oak trees, each one hundreds of years old. The woodcutter's life was relentlessly grueling. They often moved into the forest for weeks or months at a time, living in simple, temporary huts made of branches and turf, far from their families and villages. Their tools were basic by our standards, but brutally effective in skilled hands. A long-hafted felling axe to bring the giant trees crashing down, a heavy, razor-sharp breadaxe to expertly square the round logs into usable beams right there, on the forest floor, and various hand saws for trimming branches. The work was extraordinarily dangerous, with the constant risk of being crushed by falling trees or mishandling their sharp tools. It was intensely physical, demanding immense strength and stamina, but it also required a deep practical knowledge of wood and trees. These men, working deep in the royal domain, provided the essential raw material that literally built, warmed, and armed the medieval world. Deeper still in the woods, living an even more isolated and mysterious existence, were the charbonniers, the charcoal burners. In an age before coke was developed, charcoal was the only high-intensity fuel available. It was the lifeblood of medieval industry, absolutely essential for blacksmiths to forge iron into tools, weapons, and armor, and for smelters to reach the high temperatures needed to extract metal from ore. Because of their trade, charcoal burners were a strange and often ostracized group. Their faces and clothes were perpetually blackened by soot, their profession shrouded in an aura of secrecy and mystery, and they were often viewed with suspicion by outsiders. The process they used to create charcoal, known as pyrolysis, was a form of slow, controlled alchemy. It involved carefully stacking precisely cut logs of wood into a large, conical mound called a moil, which was then painstakingly covered with an almost airtight layer of turf and earth to prevent oxygen from reaching the wood. They would light the wood from a central chimney and then have to tend the smoldering kiln constantly, day and night, for over a week, sometimes longer depending on the size of the mound. Their job was a delicate balancing act. They couldn't let the fire go out, but they also couldn't allow it to burst into open flame, which would simply consume the wood and create worthless ash. They became masters of reading the smoke, judging the state of the burn by its color and smell as it changed from thick white to oily yellow to a thin, almost invisible blue, which signaled the process was complete. It was a skilled, dirty, and profoundly solitary craft, but without these secretive, soot-stained men of the forest, the forges of the kingdom would have gone cold, and its armies would have been without swords. Finally, there were the official guardians of the woods, the foresters themselves. We have already seen them through the eyes of the peasantry as the feared and hated enforcers of an oppressive law. But their job was, at least in theory, more complex than mere policing. They were, in essence, the king's land managers. Their duties included marking specific trees that were approved for felling by the Bucharans, overseeing controlled burns to clear undergrowth and promote new pasture for game, and they were meant to ensure the overall health and sustainability of the game populations they guarded so jealously. By the late 13th century, even the French monarchy, driven by economic necessity rather than any modern ecological conscience, began to realize that they needed to manage their forest resources sustainably to ensure that this vital source of royal income and pleasure didn't simply run out. Yet the foresters always walked a fine and dangerous line. Appointed by a distant king or a powerful noble, they lived their lives among the very people whose traditional livelihoods they made so difficult, the living, breathing embodiment of the king's formidable and unforgiving authority in their daily lives. Section 5. The noble's playground, the royal hunt. While the peasant looked upon the forest and saw a place of peril and desperate need, and the woodcutter saw a place of grueling, honest work, the king and his nobility saw something else entirely. To them, the forest was a magnificent open-air theater for the performance of power, pleasure, and politics. The royal hunt, known in France as la chasse à courre, the hunt with hounds, was the ultimate aristocratic pastime. It was so much more than a mere sport. It was a deeply ingrained cultural ritual, a stylized and public display of social status, martial skill, and divinely ordained dominance over the natural world. A royal hunt was a spectacular, theatrical, and ruinously costly event. It often began not with a quiet foray into the woods, but with an open-air feast, a lavish banquet set up in a forest clearing, while a veritable army of servants, grooms and huntsmen made the final meticulous preparations. And nobles themselves were dressed not for practicality, but for show, wearing their finest, brightly colored hunting clothes mounted on powerful, specially trained horses that were often as prized as war chargers. This was a major social event on the aristocratic calendar, a place to see and be seen, to forge political alliances in a less formal setting, and for the king to display his favor by extending an invitation to a particular courtier. The hunt itself was a highly structured and ritualized affair, governed by a complex etiquette that every participant was expected to know. The primary and most noble target was the hart, the adult male red deer, a magnificent creature often referred to as the king of the forest. The chase would be led by a master huntsman, a highly respected expert who would lead the procession. He would use packs of specialized hounds, some for tracking by scent, others for their speed in the chase to pursue the stag, often for many hours until it was exhausted. The entire noble procession would follow on horseback, the forest air, once so silent, now filled with the thundering of hooves and the complex, layered calls of hunting horns. Each blast of the horn was a specific signal, a piece of language that communicated the progress of the chase to the entire party, the sighting of the quarry, the losing of the trail, the cornering of the animal. When the exhausted stag was finally cornered, brought to a standstill in a clearing or a body of water, a moment known as the bay, a whole new ceremony began. The actual kill was often reserved for the highest-ranking noble present, who would dispatch the animal with a sword or a hunting spear. What followed was the curie, a precise and solemn ritual where the deer was butchered according to a strict formula. Specific parts of the venison were ceremonially given as rewards to the hounds who had performed well, to the chief huntsman, and to the most honored guests. The grand banquet that followed the hunt was a triumphant celebration, not just of a successful chase, but of the entire social hierarchy, reinforcing the power of the aristocracy and their God-given right to rule over both man and beast. This lavish, noisy, and wasteful spectacle stood in brutal and stark contrast to the silent, fearful life of the peasant. For the noble, the forest was a source of thrilling sport and political theater. For the peasant hiding at the forest edge, listening to the distant horns, the sound was a terrifying and infuriating reminder of the deep, uncrossable chasm that separated their two worlds. The very same deer that represented a thrilling chase and a magnificent trophy for a lord represented a summary death sentence for the commoner who dared to hunt it for no other reason than to feed his starving family. In this way, the king's forbidden forest was a perfect, living mirror of medieval society itself, a place of magnificent plenty and glorious sport for the powerful few, and a place of strict, often lethal, prohibition for the powerless many. Asterisk, the world of the King's Forbidden Forest reveals just how deeply and intricately our ancestors' lives were intertwined with the natural world, in ways that were both breathtakingly beautiful and shockingly brutal. These stories, hidden for centuries beneath countless layers of fallen leaves, represent a vital and often overlooked part of our shared human history. If you found this journey into the deep, dark woods of the past as compelling as I do, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It genuinely helps us to grow and gives us the opportunity to bring more of these forgotten histories to light for you. And I would truly love to hear from you in the comments section below. What specific part of life within the Forbidden Forest did you find the most surprising or the most shocking? Asterisk, the King's Forbidden Forest was so much more than a simple hunting ground or a reserve of timber. It was the vibrant, beating heart of the medieval French world, a dynamic and contested space where the lines between humanity and nature, and more critically, between the powerful and the powerless, were drawn with brutal clarity. For the peasant, on its fringes, it was a landscape defined by fear, superstition, and desperate, unmet need. For the woodcutter and the charcoal burner, it was a rugged, open-air factory, a place of hard labor and profound isolation. And for the king and his nobles, it was a private kingdom within a kingdom, a grand stage for displaying the very wealth and absolute power that the forest itself provided. The harsh, all-encompassing forest laws were more than just a set of regulations. They were a potent tool of social control, a constant physical reminder to the vast majority of the population of the king's ultimate and unassailable authority. Yet, in a strange and unforeseen twist of history, these oppressive laws also had the unintended consequence of preserving huge areas of ancient woodland from being cleared for agriculture. As the centuries passed and the monarchies of Europe began to wane, their iron grip on the land loosened. The French Revolution finally and violently abolished the aristocracy's exclusive hunting privileges. And with that, the ancient, adversarial relationship between the common people and the forests began to change forever. Today, many of these former royal forests, like the magnificent Fontainebleau, have become national treasures, protected parks, open for all to enjoy. We walk their well-marked paths for leisure and recreation, admiring their tranquil beauty, often completely unaware of the deep, dramatic, and often tragic history that lies right beneath our feet. We see a peaceful woodland, a place of quiet contemplation. But if you stand still for a moment and listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of the past carried on the wind. The rhythmic clang of a distant woodcutter's axe, the faint, desperate prayer of a poacher hiding in the shadows, and the distant, imperious call of a royal hunting horn. These ancient trees stood silent witness to it all, the patient keepers of the countless struggles and routines that defined both life and death inside the King's Forbidden Forest.